All right, we are now recording. Hi everyone, this is Mandy Knapp, and I have here with me today Lindsey Smith, the Outreach Services and Volunteer Coordinator from Worthington Libraries, and she's going to talk to us about managing library volunteers. If you'd like to view her slides on a full screen, if you click on the icon, on my screen it's in the middle of the right, and it looks like two arrows kind of pointing out to two different corners. Then you'll be able to see it in full screen. If you have any questions, please just type it into the chat and I will answer them. I think that's all. I'm going to turn it over to Lindsey.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. Like Mandy said, my name is Lindsey Smith. I'm the Outreach Services and Volunteer Coordinator for Worthington Libraries, suburb of Columbus. I am going to do a presentation on managing library volunteers. I'm going to start at the very beginning. I know some of you guys, this may have been taken care, some of the steps in this process have been taken care of for you by Mandy, but hopefully some of it will apply, and later certainly there will be information I think that will be very helpful when it comes to managing library volunteers. I've been the Outreach Services and Volunteer Coordinator here for 5 years. Before that, I was a librarian, I was a library associate, and I was also a volunteer coordinator for the American Cancer Society. So I'm going to get started talking about why we use volunteers in the library. I think there's a couple of reasons why we use volunteers. The biggest reason is because we know they can help us get work done. There are some really talented people in the community who can bring some great skills to the library. And we should take advantage of that if they want to give us their time for free. The other reason is because it really doesn't look good to turn down free help in the library. I mean, I know as a volunteer coordinator, a lot of people come in here thinking we must be able to use the help. Several years ago, they heard that our funding was cut. And so we don't want to put ourselves in a position where we're saying, oh, sorry, we don't need your free help, because people might remember that next year, a couple years down the line when we're asking for money in a levy and think, well, if you don't, if you didn't need volunteer help, why do you need even more money? Before I go on to have a plan, the other reason why I love being a volunteer manager is one of the things I love about libraries is because I love that we can incorporate libraries into or volunteers into the library because we are a community organization, and I love that we can incorporate our community in helping to run the library. And I recognize that it can be hard to manage your volunteers in the library. It's really, of course it is. Volunteers don't get nearly the training that staff do. They often don't have the supervision that staff do. So it's not surprising that we have struggles managing volunteers in the library. We oftentimes, although we don't admit it, or we don't necessarily think about it this way, we often have the same expectations of volunteers in their behavior and their work ethic and what we expect them to get done. We expect them to get all of that done without the training and the supervision and the support that we're giving our staff members. So of course it can be very difficult at times, but it can also be really rewarding and really helpful. So what I'm hoping this presentation can do today is give you some ideas on how to do that, to manage them successfully. So my first suggestion when we're talking about recruiting volunteers is to have a plan. I'm a big proponent of having a specific volunteer job that you're trying to fill and then finding volunteers to fill them. It's a lot of work to try to create a job to fit a volunteer's interest and schedule, and that is often not sustainable. Volunteers often have no idea what we actually do at the library every day. So it doesn't make sense for us to let a volunteer come in and dictate the work that needs to be done. If a volunteer comes in and says, well, I only want to work Saturdays and I want to shelve. If at your library, if you don't need shelving on Saturdays, explain that to them. Explain why that job is not helpful. You may, in your case, you may have volunteers who say, I want to come in, and I've had people say this before, I want to come in and I want to tutor students on Mondays from 10 a.m. to noon. Well, students are in school for the most part from 10 a.m. to noon, and just I'm not sure what is going through their mind, but we need to explain to them and not just say, okay, let me see what I can do. Explain to them how the library runs and how that's not helpful and maybe something that might be helpful. So when you're recruiting volunteers, be proactive, have a job in mind, advertise for that job with the set skills and schedule requirements, and then let people come to you already knowing what you are asking of them. Part of creating a plan is having a framework in mind. A framework gives you some structure, it gives you some set steps that you can follow every single time when you're bringing volunteers in so that you're being consistent. I'll talk a little bit more about consistency later. I think that's really important for creating a professional volunteer program. The first part of our framework at Worthington Libraries is an application. Anyone who's interested in volunteering fills out an application, which gives me their contact information, as well as tells me what they're interested in, when they're available, what branches they want to work at. All of that can have an impact on what kind of volunteer jobs are available. It's easy to say, I want to do shelving, we have this position open at this branch. Or I see you're interested in the Homework Help Center Old Worthington, but we only currently have a position at Northwest Library on Wednesdays. Are you willing to travel over there? It's a lot harder when people call to you and say, hey, what do you have available? And then for me, being a volunteer manager over 3 different libraries, you know, there are multiple different kinds of jobs available. Some of those jobs are dependent on schedules. Some of them are not dependent on schedules. Some of them require certain skills. Some of them don't. So it's really helpful for me to have a volunteer give me all of that information ahead of time. Because I also think it's really important to match somebody up with what they're going to be interested in. Just because they want to volunteer, if they have no interest in working with kids, but your only volunteer position available is working with children, or maybe more applicable for you guys, they really want to volunteer, but they hate working with computers, or they don't have patience for older adults, then they might say to you, oh, okay, well, I'll give it a try. That really might not work out very well. So you really want to try to match their interest and their schedule and their availability with the jobs that you have available. And the application is the first step in kind of vetting what's going to be a good fit for them. I try to have job descriptions for the majority of the volunteer jobs that we have at the library. And the job descriptions often have specific schedules tied to them as well. The job description also helps me up front weed out anyone who's going to be unable or unwilling to do a particular job. Like I mentioned before, the public often does not understand what we do at the library. I have people who come in saying they want to shelve, but then they tell me in the interview that they have bad knees and they can't get down on the floor. Their idea of shelving at the library is sitting at a desk and you know, scanning books and passing them along, which maybe that is a volunteer position at other libraries, but it's not at ours. Our volunteer job at the library is getting down on the floor, getting up on the step stool and putting those books away, pushing heavy carts. So the job description is a great opportunity for me to say, here's the job description, look at this point here. This is what I'm concerned about based on what you have told me. So the position description for shelving clearly states that they have to bend down, get down on the floor. So it's to your advantage and yours that when we're describing volunteer jobs that you're being as clear as possible about your expectations, and a job description is a really good way to do that. And a job description doesn't make it personal. You know, it's not personal. It's not because I talked to you and there's something about this interview I don't like. It's because right here in this job description, this is what we need and you are not able to provide that. And volunteers don't want to fail. I mean, I think that's something that you really should keep in mind when we're talking to volunteers and you're describing needs. Most of the time, if they have bad knees and it's going to hurt them to get down on the ground, they're not going to lie to you about whether or not they can do that job. They want to be successful at what they're doing. For the most part, if they see what you're offering and they don't like it and they don't think they're going to handle it, they're going to be able to handle it, they're almost always going to tell you. And it's always better to try to weed a volunteer out who's not going to work out from the very beginning rather than get them started and then realize it's not a good fit. So I talked a little bit about the interview already, but when I bring someone in for an interview, I do have a general form that I use to prompt questions. I like to call the interview an informal chat. It's very informal conversation, an opportunity for me to get to know them, for them to hear more about the volunteer opportunities. Sometimes in an interview is a great chance for me to say, well, you know what, you came in and you said you wanted to do this, but based on everything that you're telling me, I really think you'd be a good fit for something else. Mandy has a bunch of forms that I emailed her that she can email out to all the participants after the webinar. Some of our sample forms like the application, a job description, my interview form that I use, so that you can see that and get an idea of what those look like. I don't always ask every question on the interview form. Some of them don't always apply. But during that interview, that's what I do. I go through the interview questions and give them an opportunity to talk about themselves, what they're interested in, and get to know them. During the interview, I give them another copy of the job description, a copy of our volunteer handbook. That's something else that Mandy has, and one of my business cards. The volunteer handbook includes information about the library. And I have found that is really important for volunteers. They may be coming in and they may be only working in the adult services department, but they oftentimes want to know, how is the library structured? Where do we get our funding? What are the different departments in the library, and how do they relate to each other? And they're curious about that. And it's really helpful in their jobs as well. It's helpful for them to know how the library is structured so that if they have an issue, they're going to the right person. We know how libraries work. They may have someone who is their supervisor, but no staff person is at the library every hour that it's open. So there may be times when they need to go to somebody else if they have an issue in the library. And that's when it's helpful to know that they work in the adult services department, and here's where the rest of the adult services staff work. And maybe who's the head of the department, or who are the librarians, or who is the AV librarian. That's what the volunteer handbook is really helpful, to help get them feel like they're more comfortable in the whole structure of the library. All volunteers during that interview must also sign a copy of our Code of Conduct. It's a pretty self-explanatory document about what volunteers can do and not do in the library. I always highlight a couple of items on there. One of them is about confidentiality. I want volunteers to understand how seriously we take confidentiality in the library. And I also point out the part about patrons, asking them questions. If they're working in the library and they're working in the Homework Help Center, and a patron grabs them outside of the Homework Help Center and says, hey, can you help me find this book? I have volunteers who want to be really helpful, and maybe they're library patrons, and maybe they think, oh, I know where to find that book. But we all know how those questions start. It might be, can you help me find the cookbooks? And then it evolves into, I'm looking for this very specific Emerald cookbook. And the volunteer may not be trained to do that kind of searching. So I always let the volunteers know, you are here for this specific job. Don't be afraid to let a patron know, that's not what I'm here for, I'm just a volunteer, but let me find a staff member who can help you. So when I go through all of these different items that we use at Worthington Libraries, the application, the job description, the interview form, handbook, background check, which I'll talk more about in a minute, code of conduct, shelving test, all of that might be a lot of hoops to jump through. It may seem like a lot of hoops to jump through. I think it's really important for us because it helps us weed out the people who aren't really that serious about volunteering. If they don't want to go through all these steps, to me it's usually an indication that they may not last that long with volunteering. Volunteers are an investment. I'm spending time recruiting for these positions, training them. We're spending money on a background check. I want you to stick around for a while. I want you to be sure that this is what you are committing to. And so this is really helpful for me. If you are in a position where you really are in desperate need of volunteers and are afraid that all of these hoops are going to discourage people, you can make them less formal. You can incorporate all of the aspects of this while still making it less intimidating and less formal for a volunteer. But I think the other thing about creating a framework is it weeds out the volunteers who are not going to be serious about volunteering for you. But when you get a really great volunteer in here, maybe they're an awesome, busy human being, and they want to invest their time volunteering somewhere that's going to take their time seriously, all of these steps in the process are an indication to them that you are organized as a volunteer manager and you are taking their time seriously and you have an actual job for them and you're going to be able to articulate that and they're going to be in a positive work environment. So I think that all of this helps you retain the really good volunteers as well. So when you're working with volunteers, I mentioned earlier, I think it's really important to have consistent standards. And I mentioned I was going to talk a little bit about background checks. I understand that many of you are not in the position to make decisions about whether or not volunteers are given a background check, but I am a big advocate for background checks. And so I'll just tell you a little bit about what we do. Maybe it's something that you can take back to whoever makes those decisions at your library. At our library, it's our HR manager. But you can maybe take some of these ideas back and implement what works for your library. At Worthington Libraries, we do a background check on any adult who's going to be volunteering 8 hours or more. Doesn't matter what they're doing, working with kids, working with adults. Ours are administered, they used to be administered by Validex, but Validex just got purchased by another company, so I'm not sure who it is anymore. But they cost about $35 each to run the background check. So they're expensive. I think we're all worried whenever we think about background checks. The first thing that comes to mind is we're going to get child molesters in the library, and that's what we need to be careful of. You know, I've been doing this for 5 years. I've seen lots of background checks come back. I don't ever get the results of the background check. I just get told by our HR manager who can and cannot volunteer. I don't think we've ever had a child molester. However, we have had several people who have had theft convictions. Those are also not people that you want hanging out in your library and with access to staff area and with in putting in a position that you're asking patrons to trust them. You know, it goes without saying, there's a lot of people that I have been floored. You know, they didn't come in an interview and I looked at them and I thought, oh gosh, this person's going to be a problem. And so that's why I'm a big advocate of background checks. There are a lot of people out there who have some kind of theft or fraud or drug conviction, and when you think about how it would work out if it were to come to light that these people were given special access to our patrons and our staff in the library, I think that would be really bad for libraries. So $35 is how much we pay for ours. However, there are ways to do background checks less expensive than that. Some of your county law enforcement may do background checks for you. I've seen some very basic background checks advertised for as low as $15 a person. There are free sex offender searches on the internet if that is your biggest concern, and certainly that would be worst case scenario, there's no question. And there are some free searches on the internet. You may decide to implement a policy about who gets a background check. Maybe it's only people who are working with children or only people who are going to be, only volunteers who are going to be unsupervised in the library. But whatever you do, again, be consistent about it. You do not want to only run background checks on people that look suspicious or only run background checks on men or something like that. Volunteers are not beholden to the same equal opportunity laws as staff members are, but that doesn't mean that someone won't make a really big issue out of the fact if you are discriminating against them by running a background check on them and not somebody else. So you want to be consistent with whatever you do.
If I could just interject for a second, I recently learned that sex offender checks are free and you can do them online through a government portal called, I'm going to say NSOPR, or it might be NSOPW, but those are free background checks that will tell you whether or not a person is a sex offender.
Yeah. In Franklin County, I can sign up for, and I don't know if all counties are like this, it's an Ohio program, but I can sign up for my address at my home, and it will give me an email every time a sex offender moves within a certain vicinity. I don't see why you couldn't type in your library's address and, you know, and do that around the area, so at least you can see who lives in your area and, you know, if that person were to come in to volunteer. you would know that they're a sex offender. And it helps to have a policy too. If you know you're not going to take anybody who has any kind of theft conviction, any kind of violence conviction, put that in writing. And then again, it's not about one person. Well, but they're my neighbor and I know they didn't mean it, type thing. It's just consistent across the board. Consistency also includes who you call for references. So if you're going to call for references, call all of them or call none of them. If you have volunteers who are going to be shelving, all of them take a shelving test or you don't do it at all. At Worthington Libraries, we do a shelving test. If you are going to have volunteers who put books away in the library, I highly recommend that you do a shelving test. I think it's easy for us who work in libraries, organization, alphabetizing, putting things in numerical order, that comes easily to most of us, but it does not come easily to most people. I have lots of people who fail the shelving test, and it's not complicated. I have 15 fiction books that have to be put in order by author's last name just on the cart they're on. They're on a cart, they're out of order on the cart, they need to be put in order on the cart. I have 15 nonfiction books as well on a different shelf of that cart. The nonfiction usually don't give people problems, but and those have a Dewey Decimal Number printed on the side, so it's not even that they have to know the Dewey Decimal Number. They just need to be able to put the numbers in order. The fiction books give a lot of people trouble, though. In particular, in our community, we have a lot of really intelligent women with advanced degrees from other countries who are here on dependent visas. They want to volunteer at the library because they are not allowed to work in the United States. English is not their first language. So deciphering author first name versus last name, or the author versus the title, can be very difficult for them. And they're often horrified when they don't pass the shelving test, and they're really disappointed because they were really looking forward to working in the library. However, you really don't want someone who's going to be in the library putting Elizabeth Lowell's books in the E's. You're never going to find them. So it's embarrassing for them, and it's awkward for me to have to tell them that they failed the shelving test and they can't shelve in the library. But it's a lot better than the alternative, which is getting them started, having them lose books, having to bring them in afterwards and tell them this is not working out. So something else that's really important for volunteers is adequate training. Different volunteer positions are going to have various levels of training. The most important part about training is to make sure you give them the tools to succeed. It is not enough to just tell them how to do their job. They don't work in a bubble. At some point, there's going to be something else that happens around them. Somebody next to them is going to have a computer issue, or like I said, the volunteer manager that they usually work with is going to be gone, or something that they need is going to be moved. So it's really important that they understand how their job fits within what we're doing at the library. Why are they there? Where do they go with questions? What's the hierarchy of the library? All of these things are really important. Like I said, why is their job important? That's especially important, I think, if we're giving volunteers jobs that they think are boring, or maybe we think are boring, but we know they're important. Explain to the volunteer, this is why you are stamping these books, or this is why you are doing this, because this is a really important thing that accomplishes X, Y, and Z, and that's why we need to have you do this. If volunteers understand that there is a purpose to their job, it's a lot easier for them to buy into doing that job. The other thing that's really important about having volunteers there is getting your staff on board. I remembered one more thing I wanted to say about adequate training was that, I lost it again, so never mind. So volunteers working with staff. Staff are often suspicious of volunteers. I think that's a problem universally in libraries. They might think volunteers are there to take their job, or volunteers don't know what they're doing, but volunteers pick up on this. So, if you were, imagine yourself in a volunteer's position. You want to help out the library, you're giving your own time to do it, and you get there and people ignore you and they don't seem to notice you're there. They don't seem to appreciate your work. They're nitpicking on you all the time. They're not telling you what they want you to do, and you're going there and you're having to search around everywhere and not sure who to report to. It really doesn't make for a great work environment. If that was your job, you wouldn't want to stay. But imagine if you were there and doing it for free, then you really wouldn't want to stay. So make sure your staff understands that they need to treat volunteers as part of their department. I think that's really important for people to understand. It really seems to be that most staff think, I didn't recruit that volunteer. Volunteers are not part of my job. I don't need to have anything to do with this volunteer. If that volunteer doesn't know what they're doing or that volunteer has a question, it's not my job to answer it. It's whoever that volunteer manager's job is. And that is just a killer for the volunteer's relationship with the library. When they see staff who just are not at all interested in working with them, it really, really hurts the morale. And it makes it really hard to keep volunteers sticking around in your library. Staff will, in this case, staff will often follow the lead of their supervisors here. If there is something standing in the way of staff incorporating volunteers in the department, let's say staff are, for instance, staff might be suspicious that volunteers aren't doing their job right. Make sure you address that. If staff have concerns about volunteers, make sure there is an open line of communication to talk to the volunteer manager in the library about what the volunteer should be doing and what they should not be doing in the library. Sometimes when staff ignore volunteers in the library, it's not always malicious. It's not always intentional. In one case, I noticed that staff weren't really talking to volunteers, weren't really saying hi to volunteers when they came into the library, and I asked somebody about it. And they said, well, you know I met that volunteer, and I recognized their face, I just didn't remember their name. And I didn't want to say hi to them because I knew I should remember their name, and I didn't. You know, so the staff are really avoiding volunteers because they were embarrassed they didn't remember their name. Well, in that case, that's something that we can help them with. We can help volunteer staff get to know the volunteers. You can create if you're, web savvy, you can create a simple picture directory of the volunteers so that staff can use it to refresh their memory. We have one of those at Worthington Libraries. We actually have one of staff, which is how I got the idea. And I use the staff one all the time when new people start and I can't remember their names. I look at that staff directory. And so I made one for volunteers. You can do a low-tech way of that too. You could just post some pictures on a bulletin board. You're not posting personal information. You're just posting a quick shot of them. They could give you a picture, or you could take one and just their name and where they're going to be working and maybe when they're going to be there, Tuesdays at 2 p.m. so that staff know who to expect in the library. Another way to involve staff is in the training process of volunteers. Again, staff are often really nervous about if volunteers are doing their job right. And, there's a good reason for them to be nervous. Again, volunteers don't receive the same level of training as staff do. So if staff are nervous about it, involve them in the training process. I find that really helpful on both sides. It's really helpful for staff to see, hey, these volunteers are learning what they're supposed to be doing. I don't have to be as nervous about what they're doing in the library. And I know that they're passionate about what they're doing. The staff get to know the volunteer a little bit so they have a little bit more connection with that volunteer next time they come in. And it's also a great training opportunity for volunteers to work with a staff member who does shelving all the time. That's the example that I'm thinking of right now. But it's great for volunteers to see that staff person working and kind of shadowing them to get an idea of how they might handle certain questions or issues. All of this is just ultimately important because of what I said before. Volunteers want to feel involved in the library. They want to make a difference. That's why volunteers come to the library. I always ask during my interview, why do you want to volunteer at the library? And it's because they want to make a difference. They love the library. They want to help us out. If they come to volunteer at the library and they are not getting that, if they feel like they're invisible, if they feel like no one wants them there, they're not going to stick around. And volunteers are an investment. So it's in your best interest to keep them around as long as possible. So I talked a little bit already about integrating volunteers, but I think that is just so important in having happy volunteers, satisfied volunteers who really want to do a good job for you in the library. When you bring a new volunteer in, introduce them to the staff. Take them through the library. Even though the volunteer especially is not going to remember all those staff members' names, what they are going to remember is that someone said hi to them and gave them a friendly face, and that person is approachable, and that staff person they can go up to next time they're there and ask them a question. This is an opportunity for you to really get staff on board because you are also involving staff in the process of bringing in a new volunteer. When you introduce the staff and say, hey, staff member, this is Gary. He's a new volunteer. He's going to be working on Tuesdays, so help him out if you see it. You are creating that connection where the staff person has some responsibility over Gary. Let the staff know what the volunteer is supposed to be working on, because that's something else I run into. They might see a volunteer doing something they are not so, but they don't stop them because they think, ooh, maybe Gary is supposed to be going through those files in the manager's office or whatever he's doing. So if you tell your staff members, this is Gary, he's here on Tuesdays, he's supposed to be working with adults in the computer area, and then when they see him helping someone in the stacks find a book, then they know, okay, I am positive that Gary is not supposed to be doing that, so that's something that I should put an end to, or that's something that I should talk to Gary's supervisor about and make sure Gary's supervisor knows so that we can nip that behavior before it gets out of hand. It's important to designate a supervisor. A volunteer supervisor does not necessarily have to have the same kind of supervisory role as they would if they were supervising a staff person. We don't have formal evaluations for volunteers like we do for staff members, but volunteers always just feel more comfortable knowing who is the person that they should go to if they have a question. It's always good for them to feel like they have a supervisor, even if it's really just an informal supervisor. One of the questions that I ask during interviews is, what does a volunteer need from the library to make volunteering a positive experience for them? The most popular answer from volunteers who are savvy and self-aware is that they want clear expectations. The volunteer coordinator is not always the best person to be a volunteer supervisor and provide those clear expectations. For me, my job as the volunteer coordinator is to find out what jobs we have available in the library, recruit them, place the volunteers. But if the volunteer is working in story time and they come to me with a very specific question about story time, I don't supervise story times. I don't run story times. I am not the best person to answer that question. The Storytime programmer is the best person to answer that question, and that's why I have designated the Storytime programmer as that volunteer supervisor. And that is the best relationship that you can set up, is between the person who needs the volunteer and the volunteer themselves. So there doesn't need to be progress report, formal meetings, but there does need to be a clear expectation of who is the supervisor. And then just some understanding of the greater organization so that their supervisor is not available, who might be the next best person to ask. All right, when it comes to volunteers, it's really important to recognize them as well. And again, recognition does not have to be anything formal. A volunteer who is chosen carefully, placed correctly, trained, and placed with the staff that embrace them is probably going to be successful and require very little by the way of maintenance. Most volunteers do not want a lot of recognition for what they do. A simple personal thank you that is heartfelt and demonstrates that you recognize what the volunteer is contributing, that's really all they're looking for. They want to do a good job, and they want their good job to be recognized, even if that is only with a thank you. You know, thank you, Gary. I saw how difficult that conversation was with that patron at the computer. I saw you guys spent an hour working on his job application and you never lost your patience. That was a great job. You know, that kind of thank you acknowledges that you noticed what Gary did, you noticed that he was working hard at what he was supposed to be doing, and you really appreciate it. That's what most of them want. Those kind of thank yous mean more from the staff or the department that the volunteer is working for than they do coming from me. So if you are that staff and you see that interaction with that volunteer, you are the right person to give that thank you. not send it to me, the volunteer manager, and have me send it to Gary in an email 2 days later. Hey, Gary, I saw, Karen saw you do a great interaction with that patron. That is weird, okay? Karen can just go tell Gary thank you. It seems awkward when it comes from me. So please don't rely on your volunteer manager to provide those kind of thank yous. Empower your staff to thank the volunteers. Some recognition ideas that you have if you want to go above the simple thank yous. If that's all you can do, then that's all you can do. But there are some other ideas that don't cost a lot of money. And it's important not to spend a lot of money because volunteers don't want it. I tell you that. They volunteer with the library because they love it and because they think we need some extra help. And so when we spend money on them, they get kind of mad about it. They're like, I'm here so you can save money, so don't spend money on me to recognize me. Now, that's the majority of volunteers. You will sometimes get volunteers who really love the recognition and wouldn't mind a Starbucks gift card. But for the most part, don't feel pressure to spend money on your volunteers because the majority of them don't want it. But there are some other things that you could do that would recognize them and don't cost a lot of money. One thing that we do at Worthington Libraries is we have a staff potluck for them in the fall. We have a little party. We cater the main meal. So we cater about $130 in the main meal, and then we spend, $20 on tablecloths and balloons, and we just have a dinner for them. We have a short presentation. We give out a volunteer award that's sponsored by our friends, and it's a really nice night, and it doesn't cost a lot of money. It costs your time. That's the most important thing that volunteers are looking for us is our time to say thank you, our time to recognize them for their contributions, our time making them some food and bringing it to a potluck. You can send them a card. At Worthington Libraries, we do a book plate for volunteers who have done 10 hours or more in the past year. A book plate is really a fancy name for Avery stick-on mailing label that gets put in the front of the book that says, in honor of Gary Jones Volunteer Service at Worthington Libraries. The volunteers love that, and that only takes staff time and the cost of a box of Avery labels. So that's a really easy way to recognize them. Let's see. And it's important to understand who wants public recognition and who doesn't. Some volunteers, like I said, some volunteers would love to get Starbucks gift cards and have their names in the newspaper. If you have volunteer awards in your community or even in your library that you can nominate those type of volunteers for, then do it. Even if they don't win, they're often recognized as being a nominee, and that in itself just shows the volunteer that you recognize what they do and you want others to see that as well. But there are some volunteers that really don't want that. They really just want to remain anonymous, so respect that. And even if they are the most amazing volunteer and they would win hands down, maybe just tell them, hey, you know what, Darby, I wish I could volunteer you. I wish I could nominate you for this award. I know you, or maybe you just ask them, I'd like to nominate you for this award. Would you like that? And then if maybe they wouldn't like that, but they probably like knowing that you thought of them. All right, so when you have problems with volunteers, I think it is the most important, the best thing that you can keep in mind is to treat them like staff. Even with all the care that you take to recruit, select, place, and train volunteers, problems may still come up. For whatever reason, people feel like what to do with problem volunteers is so tricky because volunteers give us our time for free, and it seems like to some people we don't have the right to be picky about what they do because they're doing it for free. And I really don't believe that's true. Volunteers should be helping us reach our mission, and the public thinks using volunteers is a cost-saving measure. So if you have a volunteer that is causing you problems, is disruptive, needs way too much supervision, sometimes you get that volunteer who just cannot work on their own. You constantly have to go. They have constant questions. They're not moving towards working independently, and you are just spending way too much time on them. And then that is the time when it's time to talk about that relationship and what do we need to do differently and where can we put you somewhere else, or maybe it's time for you to look for volunteer work elsewhere. It really helps for me to think about volunteers as another member of our staff. What would you do if you had a paid shelver who wasn't shelving correctly? You wouldn't, and what we tend to do with volunteers is we talk about it amongst each other. If you're not the volunteer manager, staff see volunteers doing things wrong and they talk about it amongst each other, but they often are afraid to let somebody know. If we had a paid staff member who was having the same kind of issues, I really hope you wouldn't be afraid to tell their supervisor. I really hope you would talk to their supervisor so that we can address it immediately, because that's what you want to do. You want to address problem behaviors immediately. You do not want to address them 3 months down the road. First of all, if it's a volunteer, in the most cases, it's a volunteer who doesn't realize they're not doing their job right. And for them to find out 3 months later they've been doing it wrong the whole time, that's embarrassing, and they're disappointed. They wanted to be doing it right, and to find out that they've been doing it wrong for 3 months is not a great situation. Address it immediately. Volunteers want to succeed. I mentioned that earlier. There's really no advantage for volunteers to be here in most cases, other than they really want to give us their time. So they want to succeed, help them succeed by giving them corrections when they need it. Also, what we do with paid staff is we document them. So do that. Document every time you have to have a conversation with them, so that if the issues continue to escalate, you have it down on paper. On this date, I talked to you about this. On this date, I talked to you about it again. And then if you want to look at your HR manual and get an idea of how the HR managers handle progressive discipline, then do that and kind of create an improvised version for volunteers. But it's a great framework to have in mind, and that also helps you understand, okay, because sometimes it's easy to go, gosh, we just keep having these problems with the same volunteer. When you document the situation, it really helps you to see, all right, this has really gotten out of control and we need to do something about it. I expect supervisory staff to let me know about, or to provide minor on-the-job corrections. So whoever that person is, their supervisor, I'm going to give them little stuff here and there. Actually, when we take a volunteer when we take a patron to the stacks, we walk them there. We don't just. But anything stickier than that, I, as a volunteer manager, will handle that. Almost all of the volunteer problems I've encountered have to do with not being able to perform job functions, and this is what I would refer to as like deal killer volunteer problems. They usually have to do with not being able to perform the job functions. You get someone in there and they just are not able to learn the way that we shelve in the library. The number of departments that we have is overwhelming to them. But when you're talking with volunteers to start with, maybe this is the first time that you have an issue, you may want to give them a little bit more leeway than you would a paid staff member. Remember, they did not likely have the intensive training and orientation that a staff member had. But again, you still want to document that situation, even if you're, giving them a little bit more leeway than you would a staff member. So for instance, an example I would use is, let's say Mark is having trouble shelving fiction. First you grab him and say, hey Mark, I saw there were some fiction out of order last week. Let's go over that section again. Okay, sometimes that's really all they need. They just need a second chance at the orientation. And then the next week you say, Mark, there's still some fiction out of order. Do you have any questions about what we went over last week? And that kind of still plants a seed in Mark's, well, first of all, you're telling Mark still you're doing it wrong. But it kind of plants a seed in his mind that, hey, they keep having to talk to me about this stuff. Maybe this is not what I'm good at. Most volunteers, if you continue to address their behavior, and they're going to self-select themselves out of volunteering, they're going to say, you know what, clearly I'm not that good at this because they keep having to talk to me week after week after week about the same things. So what I have found is, for the most part, if you are addressing issues with volunteers and they are just not getting it, a lot of them will decide not to volunteer anymore. They may say, hey, my schedule changed, or they may, just flat out tell you, this doesn't seem to be the right fit for me. That is the best case scenario. If you happen to place a volunteer and they're not in the position they should be in and they select themselves out of it, then that's the best position that we could possibly put ourselves in. Every once in a while, though, I have a volunteer who's just not getting it, and I have to make an appointment with them, sit down, tell them it's not working out, try to see if we can move them somewhere else in the library. It's not a negative conversation. It's just that this is not working out for us right now. And it's not fun, but it hardly ever happens. So I want to go over a couple of other items really briefly, and then we'll do questions. If you guys have questions about liability, that's something you should be talking to your legal counsel about. There are some federal acts and some state laws that protect volunteers themselves for immunity for something they might do in the library. For instance, the Good Samaritan Act. If they try to give someone CPR and that person dies, they're protected under the Good Samaritan law, as long as they're, not purposely doing CPR incorrectly. But if you are concerned about your insurance, you may be able to purchase additional. Volunteers are usually not covered under workers' compensation, although you could choose to purchase that if you wanted to. Very few libraries do that. But liability is something that you should be talking with your legal counsel or your HR manager, whoever handles that in your library. If you have teens in your library, I, for the most part, do not supervise teens. I'm the adult volunteer coordinator, but I sometimes interview or supervise practicum students or students who are doing internships. If you do work with teens in the library, the most important thing to remember is that they really come in with zero job experience. You have to be very explicit about what is expected of them in terms of showing up on time, using their cell phone, what to wear, basic customer service, all of that stuff that we can take for granted. Working teens do not understand that. So, and they really, some of them really struggle to do what we would consider basic job functions. And that's not because they're not capable or they're not smart, it's because they have never been exposed to a business environment before. So just remember that. Short-term volunteers, this is something that I struggle with at the library because I get people who come in and they only want to do 20 hours. And that's not helpful for us. Again, with the background check, most of our jobs in the library require extensive training. And so short-term volunteers, for the most part, don't work out for that, for us. I'd like to find some more ways to try to incorporate them, but for the most part, it doesn't really work. Especially short-term volunteers who want to work like 8 hours a day. If I had that kind of hole, we'd have to hire additional staff members. I mean, there aren't very many projects in the library that just need someone to come in for 8 hours for 2 weeks and then never show up again. So some of your libraries may be able to utilize short-term volunteers, but we really struggle here. And court order community service. These volunteers require more paper than the average volunteer. They don't necessarily have to have more supervision unless that's what their documentation from the court requires, but they are a little bit different in that they don't necessarily have the same altruistic motives that other volunteers do that I mentioned before. They are not necessarily here out of the goodness of their heart because they love the library. So the reality is sometimes they do require more supervision because they just aren't as motivated. They aren't as self-motivated to be here. We have very strict rules at our library about what kind of community service we will accept, and that weeds out a lot of people who want to do court order community service. Because like I kind of mentioned before, we have a lot of requests to volunteer at our library, so I only want to get the most amazing candidates. And if you're doing court order community service, I've had some amazing people who do court order community service, but for the most part, our frameworks that I mentioned, the application, the background check, the interview, most of them don't want to go through that. A lot of them need a lot of hours in a really short amount of time, and I can't accommodate that. I will tell them you can go somewhere else and supplement, but I can only give you 2 to 3 hours a week. But when I do have volunteers who have planned well and they are able to accomplish all their hours at the library and they're willing to go through everything that we make them go through, I've had amazing court order community service volunteers. And one of them even still volunteers with us like 5 years later. So if they're willing to apply, be interviewed, take the background check, get training, if they meet your requirements, for us, basically the only thing we will take is a DUI because we don't take any kind of theft, violence, anything with kids, anything with drugs. So court order community service can be a little bit tricky, but I think you can, if you put steps in place and requirements in place for them ahead of time, you will really weed out the candidates that you don't want at your library. Okay, so that is the majority of my presentation. Are there any questions that anybody has?
If you type your questions into the chat box, I will read them aloud so Lindsay can answer them. I do have one question for you, Lindsay.
Yeah.
Do you ever have like a special event that you need to supplement with volunteers? And if so, do you have any tips for doing that?
Yeah, you know, so I think I mentioned our background checks are only for volunteers who are going to do 8 hours or more. So that leaves a little window for those special events if they're just going to come in and do one special event. What I usually do for those, we've never had an event since I've been here where we had to really have a ton of volunteers. However, oftentimes if I have a bigger event, I'll supplement with teen volunteers. I'll ask the teen librarians to send it out to their teens as well, because it's often programmed, so it's often something like running a craft station or greeting people. However, in Columbus, if I ever did need to utilize, I'd use Hands-On Central Ohio, which has a volunteer project calendar, so you can put your project on there, and then you kind of open up your audience really wide. There's also a website called Join Us Columbus, and I don't know that it's only limited to Columbus, but that is another place where you can post volunteer opportunities, and other people can find them outside of maybe who comes into the library. When I do need to advertise for volunteer jobs, I put it on our website. There's a space on our website for volunteer jobs. I post them inside the libraries, and I will often post them out to Ohio State University for our Homework Help Center jobs. I'll post them out to the high school. I'll ask the high school library media specialist, or even middle school, or not middle school, only the high school. I was thinking of the private schools in the area, and I'll ask them to post for stuff if we really need a ton of volunteers. We use high schoolers in our Homework Help Center a lot, and those are they are a really great fit for our Homework Help Center, so that's what I majority of the time send out to the high schools.
And just so everyone knows, the Homework Help Center is like a drop-in area where students can get assistance on school assignments? Is that correct?
Oh, yeah. Yes, that's correct.
I think you may have answered this question in your last, as part of my last question, but do you ever recruit volunteers that have like specific skill sets, like you're really looking for, I don't know, someone to do resume reviews?
Yeah, you know, so it's funny. We have tried before at Worthington Libraries to kind of do what you guys are doing. So I am going to be really interested to see how that works out, because I would love to do something like that at Worthington Libraries. So we never with resume type stuff. We've never made that kind of leap into letting volunteers provide tech help, mostly because we just weren't sure what kind of schedule to have them work on. But otherwise, yes, mostly with interest, not necessarily with skills. We have tried to find volunteers who have Spanish skills, because we have a growing Spanish population in the Worthington area, and that's proven to be a little bit difficult. But I've tried to recruit volunteers who can knit and crochet for a program that we do called Warm Up Worthington. We also have volunteers working a lot in the gardens around the library, so I've tried to recruit for people who have interest in gardening. And when I try to do this kind of specialized recruiting, I try to go to the places that might have those volunteers. So we have a garden club in Worthington, so we advertise at the garden club. Or there's a couple yarn stores in Worthington, so in the Worthington area. So I would go to there and maybe see if I can put something up there. But as far as tech skills goes, I've never been in the position to recruit for specified tech skills.
Thanks, Lindsay. We have another question. If I need someone to come for a one-day conference as a volunteer, do I still need to set this person up for a background check? The class or conference would be adults attending, and it's a professional guest.
I would say first set up a policy on that, but I would think no. I mean, according to our policy, you have to volunteer 8 hours or more to have a background check, and I like that. It's served us well, because it does allow you to bring someone in for a one-off just little thing that you want them to do and then they're never going to come back again, especially when they're not going to be one-on-one with anybody. But the better thing to do is to set up what your policy is going to be on whether or not you run background checks. And then the answer next time it comes around and you think, okay, well that was a 4-hour session, this is a 6-hour session, what should I do? You just have a policy in place and you know what to do every time.
Thank you. Do we have any other questions? I'll give everyone just a few more minutes to chat, or to type, because the typing does take longer than talking. You may also want to check with your library to see what they have done in the past. Maybe they have, a lot of times the library will have like an informal policy that's not really written down, but they'll still operate, you know, the same way each time. Okay, I'm not seeing any more questions, so thank you so much for your time, Lindsey. That was really helpful and informative, and again, just thank you so much.
Oh, you're welcome.
And this session will be recorded, so if you'd like to review it later, you certainly can.